The rain had been falling against the greenhouse glass for nearly an hour when Lydia Penhallow stopped walking and stood very still at the far end of the long room, among the forced lilies whose scent was almost too heavy to breathe. The glass above her ran with water in long rivulets, distorting the lamplight from the house beyond, and the sound of it was a steady, enclosing hiss that made the world outside seem very distant and the world inside be very close. She had come to cut stems for the breakfast table. That was what she had told the housekeeper, and it was even true. And now she stood with a small pair of scissors in her hand and did not move, because at the far end of the greenhouse, between the tiered shelves of winter orchids, the Duke of Hartcross had his arms around her younger sister, and Arabella was kissing him with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had chosen her moment. Lydia watched for 3 full seconds. She registered Sebastian's hands, one at Arabella's waist, one rising toward her dark hair, and she registered the way the lamplight caught the glass above them both. And she registered, with a clarity that surprised even herself, that she felt no impulse to make a sound. Her face did not collapse. What moved across it instead was something smaller and more precise. A brief, contained smile, the kind that belongs to a woman who has just seen a proof confirmed. She turned away from the orchids and walked back through the greenhouse door and into the wet evening without cutting a single stem. The vestibule of the dower house was cold when she reached it, the flagstones damp from the draft under the door, and the 2 trunks sat exactly where she had left them that morning. Fully strapped, the leather buckles tight, the labels written in her own hand. Beside the smaller trunk, her traveling coat was folded over the hall chair. Lydia reached into her reticule and drew out a folded document. The lease renewal for the Larkfield Barn School, signed in her own name, dated 7 days ago, the ink long since dry. She pressed it flat between her fingers once, feeling the weight of it, then tucked it back. The trunks were ready. The lease was signed. The barn was hers through Michaelmas of the following year, and the 40 children who came to it on weekday mornings would come again on Monday, regardless of what had just taken place between an orchid shelf and a lamppost in the Hartcross greenhouse. Lydia sat down on the hall chair beside her traveling coat and folded her hands in her lap and waited for her breathing to settle, which it did, because it had never been very unsettled to begin with. The scissors were still in her hand. She set them on the trunk lid with a small, definite click. She had known, she supposed, for a week. Not about Arabella specifically. That had been a surprise in the way that a word you already half knew is a surprise when you finally hear it spoken aloud. What she had known for a week was that she was leaving. The rest was detail. It had begun at a dinner at Hartcross, on a Thursday evening with candles and cold soup and the usual county families arranged around a table too long for the number of people at it. Lydia had been seated near the lower end, which was customary, and she had been speaking to no one in particular when she heard Sebastian's voice from across the table, unhurried and pleasant, carrying the way voices carry when the conversation around them has briefly lapsed. He had been speaking to Mr. Fordyce, the magistrate, and what he said was this: "Miss Penhallow is a sensible, composed woman. One is not moved exactly, but one could do far worse." He said it the way a man states a fact about the weather, accurately, without malice, without the faintest awareness that the woman being described was 4 feet to his left, and that the lull in conversation was precisely wide enough to carry every syllable to her ears. Lydia had not flinched. She had lifted her wine glass and taken a small, measured sip and set it down again, and returned her attention to the bread roll she had been breaking apart. And she had continued to do so for the remainder of the dinner, without any visible alteration in her manner. Mr. Fordyce had said something in response that she did not catch. Sebastian had laughed pleasantly. One is not moved. She had heard those words before, of course. Not in that precise form, but in every form that amounted to the same verdict. Dependable Lydia. Steady Lydia. Lydia, who could be trusted with the household accounts, and the dying mother and the younger sister's come-out and the management of an estate she did not own. Lydia, who was sensible. Lydia, who was composed. She had heard it said so many times, with such consistent warmth, that she had stopped noticing it the way one stops noticing the sound of a clock. But there is a difference between a clock ticking and a clock being read aloud at dinner by a man who intends to marry you. And that difference, it turned out, was considerable. She had driven back to the dower house in the dark and sat down at the small desk in the parlor where she kept the school's account books, and she had opened the ledger to the current page and read through the figures by candlelight. The rent receipts, the chalk order, the small quarterly payment to Mrs. Brent, who came on Wednesdays to help with the younger children. And somewhere between the October figures and the November projection, she had understood, with the same calm that had served her all her life, that she was not going to marry Sebastian Mercer. She was not angry. She had examined the question of anger carefully, the way she examined everything, and found that what she felt was not anger, but something more like recognition, the sensation of seeing, at last and clearly, a thing that had been present for a long time. She had accepted Sebastian's courtship because being chosen had felt like a door opening. And she had been so long in rooms where no door opened that she had not paused to ask what the room on the other side contained. Now she knew. It contained a man who found her adequate. A man who had courted a function, steady, sensible, undemanding, rather than a person, and who had done so with perfect sincerity because he had never once troubled to distinguish between the two. By morning she had written to the Larkfield landlord and renewed the barn lease from her own quarterly rent. By the afternoon she had begun packing the first trunk, working through it with the methodical attention she brought to any task worth doing. She packed the account books last, wrapping them in brown paper, because she would need them in the morning. The memory of Sebastian's hand on her back at the county assembly the previous spring came to her once while she was folding her winter dresses. The brief, guiding pressure of his palm between her shoulder blades as he steered her through a doorway, and the way his gaze had moved past her to the room beyond before the touch was even finished. She had thought nothing of it at the time. She thought of it now and understood it as a kind of summary. The touch without the attention, the form of care without its substance. She had been, for Sebastian Mercer, a very comfortable arrangement. And he had been, for her, the first person to offer one. And neither of those facts was anyone's tragedy. But neither of them was a marriage. She placed the last book in the trunk and pressed the lid closed and buckled it. And that was that. Sebastian found her note on the Saturday morning, delivered by the dour houseboy who handed it to the butler, with the unconcerned manner of a child carrying something he did not understand. The note was brief, composed in Lydia's clear, even hand, and it dissolved the engagement in 3 sentences. It named no grievance. It requested nothing. It did not accuse him of anything, and it did not leave any question open. He read it twice, standing in the hall in his riding coat. And then he set it on the side table and waited for her to appear. He waited through the morning. She did not appear. He sent a note to the dower house. The housekeeper's reply arrived within the hour, informing him that Miss Penhallow had resumed her Tuesday arrangements and was otherwise occupied, but wished his grace well. Tuesday arrangements. He turned the phrase over and found he had no idea what it meant. He rode to the dower house on the Sunday. She received him in the front parlor, where a fire had been laid, and the tea things were already set out. And she poured for him with the same unhurried competence she brought to every domestic task. And she asked after his ride. And she asked whether the road past the lower field had flooded yet with the recent rain. He sat across from her and waited for the wound to show itself. The reproach, the tears, the opening through which he might apologize. And none of it came, because there was no wound displayed, no door left ajar. And after 11 minutes, he found himself standing in the hall again, with his hat in his hands and no clearer sense of what had just happened than when he arrived. He rode home more unsettled than if she had wept at him for an hour. The county read the broken engagement as Lydia's misfortune, which was predictable and not entirely wrong. Sebastian's betrothal to Miss Arabella Penhallow was announced within the fortnight, a thing that moved through the drawing rooms of the neighborhood, with the swift, satisfied energy of a story that confirmed what everyone had privately expected. The younger sister. Of course. The pretty one. Poor Lydia, they said, with a sympathy that cost nothing and changed nothing. Lydia heard none of it, because she was not at those tables. The Larkfield Barn School stood at the eastern edge of the village, in a tithe barn that had not held grain in 40 years, and had been let to Lydia for a sum so modest it barely registered in the estate accounts. She had taken it 4 years ago with her own rent money and a set of rough benches she had bought from a carpenter in the next village. And she had opened it on a Monday morning in October to 11 children and an oil lamp and a set of alphabet cards she had made herself the previous weekend. There were now 40 children on those benches, ranging in age from 5 to 14. 2 of them, girls named Ellen and Martha, had arrived the previous autumn from the parish workhouse, thin and quiet and unable to write their own names. By March, Ellen could read a full page of plain prose without stopping. Martha had taken to numbers with a focused ferocity that made Lydia's heart do something she could not name. The barn was cold in the mornings and smelled of chalk and old timber and the particular damp warmth of children gathered close together. And there was chalk dust on every surface and on Lydia's sleeve by 9 o'clock most days. And the ledger on the teacher's desk showed, in Lydia's precise figures, that the school had operated for 4 years without a single outside patron, funded entirely from her own quarterly income. The county said she was good with children and poor in prospects, and said it with a benevolent vagueness that implied these 2 facts were related. The county had not looked at the ledger. Sebastian began appearing at Larkfield in early November, on no stated errand. The first time, he stayed on the lane, visible through the barn's high window as a figure on a gray horse, who sat for several minutes and then rode away. The second time, he came to the barn door and stood in it for a moment while the children were reciting their tables. And Lydia glanced up at him and returned to the recitation without breaking her count. And after a moment, he left. The third time was a wet Tuesday, when the wind was coming in sideways through a broken shutter on the north wall and blowing cold air directly across the children's benches. He came in without speaking, assessed the shutter, and took off his coat. He pressed it over the gap with his shoulder and held it there while he looked for something to wedge it with, and found a length of broken timber on the floor that served well enough, and pinned the coat in place and stepped back. He did not look at Lydia when he did it. He did not say anything. The coat was not positioned to block the draft from her side of the room. It was on the children's side, covering the gap where the cold came in across the small benches. He had done it for them, not for her, and he had not said so. And Lydia watched him from the front of the room and felt something shift very slightly in the account she had been keeping. She did not offer him tea. He did not ask for it. He retrieved his coat at the end of the morning and rode away. And on the following Tuesday, he came back. The flood arrived on a Thursday night in late November, without much warning beyond the color of the afternoon sky. And by dusk, the road between Larkfield and the village was under 2 feet of moving water. 2 children from the far tenant farms had come to the barn that morning and could not now get home. And Lydia had sent word to their families and settled them on the dry benches with blankets and the remainder of the day's bread, and was calculating how long the lamp oil would last when Sebastian arrived at the barn door in a riding coat dark with rain. His horse left at the village inn because the lower path had washed. "I heard the road was gone," he said, which was not an explanation of why he had come, but was apparently all the explanation he intended to offer. Lydia looked at him for a moment. "There's a pot of water on the trivet," she said. "If you want tea, you'll have to manage it yourself." He managed it himself. By midnight, one of the children, the boy, Thomas, 8 years old and slight for his age, was feverish, his face flushed and his breathing rapid. And Lydia had sent the other child to wake the village doctor, and was pressing a damp cloth to the boy's forehead when Sebastian came and stood on the other side of the rough cot without being asked. "We should move him to the dry end," Lydia said. "Away from the wall." The cot was heavy and awkward, a farm thing built for durability rather than ease, and they lifted it between them in the low lamplight, Lydia at one end, Sebastian at the other. And their hands met on the rail as they set it down, her left hand and his right, and neither of them withdrew. The moment held for the length of one breath over the sleeping child, the lamp guttering slightly in the draught. And then Lydia shifted her grip, and they set the cot down level, and she returned to the cloth and the fever. They sat on opposite sides through the rest of the night. Sebastian did not try to speak, and Lydia did not prompt him to. And the quiet between them was not the quiet of two strangers, but something more complicated. The silence of two people who have run out of the roles they usually play and have not yet found what comes next. Near dawn, when the fever broke and Thomas's breathing slowed and steadied into sleep, Sebastian reached across the cot and closed his hand over hers. Not to do anything with it, not to convey a message or make a claim. He reached for her specifically. Not for her help, not for her competence, not for the steady, capable woman who managed things. And his hand was warm, and she could feel that it was not quite steady. Lydia looked at him across the sleeping boy. His face in the early gray light was tired and less composed than she had ever seen it, and he was watching her with an attention she had not encountered from him before. Not the pleasant social regard of a man at a dinner table, but something that looked like actual, effortful seeing. She said nothing. She turned back to check the boy's breathing, but she did not move her hand. The following week, at the parish assembly in the village hall, a child named William Greer spotted Sebastian near the door and ran to him with the uncalculating confidence of a child who has decided an adult is trustworthy. "Are you coming to Miss Penhallow's barn on Tuesday?" William asked. "She said we might do the Globe this week." Sebastian looked down at the boy. "Miss Penhallow's barn," he said. "The school," William said, with the slight impatience of a child correcting an obvious misunderstanding. "In Larkfield. In Miss Penhallow's school." Sebastian asked 3 questions after that, of 3 different people. And within the hour, he had learned the following: that the barn school had operated for 4 years, that it was funded from Lydia's own income, that it sat on land belonging to the Hartcross estate, and that Arabella, as her first act of ducal patronage, intended to clear the barn for a garden folly and replace the school with a properly endowed institution to be built at some unspecified future date. He found Arabella in the assembly room's smaller parlor and closed the door. "The barn at Larkfield," he said. Arabella looked up from her conversation with Mrs. Fordyce, assessed his expression, and excused herself with a smile. When they were alone, she said, "I have been meaning to speak to you about that." "Have you?" he said. "It is an informal arrangement, Sebastian. A barn. My plans for the east grounds will require the building, and there is no legal instrument that prevents—" "Lydia built that school," Sebastian said. She has funded it for 4 years from her own rent. 40 children attended. Which is charming, Arabella said, and which is why I intend to replace it with something permanent and properly endowed when the plans are— When? Sebastian said. Arabella was quiet for a moment, and in that moment something shifted in the room. It is a barn, Sebastian, on Heartcross land. It is her life's work, Sebastian said, on Heartcross land, and you intend to close it before the wedding, so it cannot be reopened. He watched her face. I want you to leave it out of the estate plans, entirely. I won't do that, Arabella said, and her voice had lost its social warmth and become something cleaner and colder underneath. The announcement is already arranged for the winter assembly. It will be done before the wedding, and then it will be done. Sebastian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had gone very still. The greenhouse, he said. Last week. You knew she would be walking through. Arabella did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. When she spoke, her voice had the particular carelessness of a person who has decided that concealment is no longer worth the effort. She was going to leave regardless, Arabella said. You had already decided she was suitable, not that you wanted her. I simply clarified the situation. Sebastian went quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. The easy fluency that had always characterized his speech seemed to have gone somewhere else, and what was left was slower and more deliberate. I was managed, he said, because I was easy to manage, because I never bothered to know either of you well enough to see it. He paused. That is not an accusation. It is an account of what I did. He left the parlor without another word, and Arabella stood alone in the small room and understood, for the first time, that she had miscalculated something she had not thought it possible to miscalculate. Sebastian came to the Dower House 3 days later and offered to place the school under Heartcross patronage. Proper funding, legal permanence, the protection of the estate name in perpetuity. Lydia poured the tea and listened to the full offer without interrupting. When he had finished, she set down the pot and said, No. Sebastian had not expected that. Lydia, I know what that arrangement means, she said. It means the school continues as long as whoever holds Heartcross wishes it to continue. I have watched what goodwill does when the circumstances that produced it change. She looked at him steadily. You are a decent man, Sebastian, but you will not always be the Duke of Heartcross, and I will not build 40 children's futures on the goodwill of whoever comes after you. Then what will you do? He asked. Arabella has fixed the announcement for the winter assembly. She will close it before the wedding. Then I will be at the winter assembly, Lydia said, with my students. Arabella arrived at the Dower House the following afternoon, 3 days before the assembly, and Lydia received her in the same parlor, with the same composed attention she brought to every encounter. Arabella sat down and arranged her skirts, and said, without preamble, that she was prepared to offer terms. Leave quietly, Arabella said. Say nothing at the assembly. Make no scene, and I will delay the barn closure for 6 months. That is time enough to find another arrangement. You keep your dignity. I keep the estate's plans on schedule, and no one need make this unpleasant. Lydia poured the tea. She handed her sister a cup and waited until Arabella had taken it before she said, I have already left. Arabella blinked. I beg your pardon? I packed my trunks the week before the greenhouse, Lydia said. I have nothing to protect and nothing to lose, and I need nothing from you. I have already gone. Arabella set down her cup. Then why are you still here? Because the children's recital is on Thursday, Lydia said, and I spent 6 weeks preparing it. She looked at her sister with a directness that was not unkind, but was entirely without accommodation. "I hope you enjoy being charming to a man who chose you specifically because you would not trouble him, Arabella. That has an expiry, in my experience." Arabella rose from her chair. The color in her face was not quite anger. It was something more difficult, the particular discomfort of a person who has seen something about themselves they cannot argue with. She left without finishing her tea, and Lydia watched her go, and then cleared the cups and went back to the account books, because there was a supply order for January that still needed checking. The county, when it heard that Lydia had refused the Duke's offered assistance, interpreted this as pride-tipping into eccentricity. Invitations slowed. The social world that had once included her at its margins, as a useful, sensible presence, good for making up numbers, contracted and rearranged itself around the coming Duchess of Hartcross, and Lydia was left outside it with 40 children and their families and a barn in Larkfield. And she found that she minded this considerably less than she had expected. The Larkfield Winter Assembly filled the town hall on a Thursday evening in December, the room lit with candles and smelling of pine boughs and damp wool. The county families arranged along the front in their good chairs, and the village families behind them, and the tenant farmers and their wives along the walls. Arabella sat near the front with the Fordyce and the Hargreaves, in a new dress of deep blue, and she looked exactly as a future duchess should look, which was to say that she looked like someone who had already won. Lydia sat at the back with Ellen and Martha and William Greer and 37 other children, and their families around them, and a small stack of printed programs that she had written out herself by hand because there had not been money for the printer. The assembly's business proceeded in its usual order. The charitable accounts were read. The winter relief subscriptions were announced. And then Arabella rose and spoke, in a clear and pleasant voice, about the importance of proper educational provision for the children of the estate, and the plans of the new Duchess of Hartcross to replace the informal arrangement currently operating in the Larkfield barn with a properly endowed institution, to be built on the estate grounds. When the plans were finalized, she framed it as progress. She framed it as generosity. She sat down to a murmur of approval from the front rows. The room began to shift back to its ordinary business when Lydia stood up. "If it would please the assembly," she said, into the slight surprise her standing had produced. "The children have prepared a small recital. It will not take long." The room allowed it, as rooms generally allow things proposed by women who ask politely and promise brevity. The children came forward, 40 of them, straightening their jackets and their pinafores, settling themselves on the chairs that had been arranged at the front. And they performed. They played the pieces Lydia had taught them on the battered upright that stood against the hall's east wall, and they recited the poems they had memorized, and Ellen and Martha stood up together and read aloud from a page of plain prose, without error, without hesitation, their voices steady and clear in the candlelit room. When the last child sat down, Lydia remained standing. "I should like to offer some information about the school," she said, "since its future has been discussed this evening." The room was quiet in a way it had not been before. "The school at Larkfield has operated for 4 years," Lydia said. 40 children attended. 2 of those children arrived from the parish workhouse 14 months ago, unable to write their names. Both read tonight, without assistance. The school has received no outside patronage in 4 years of operation. It has been funded entirely from my own quarterly rent income, and the lease is paid in full through Michaelmas of next year. She paused. A duchess may close a barn. She may clear the building and alter the grounds and call it reform, and no law prevents her. But she cannot close what lives in 40 pairs of hands. And I want this assembly to know where those hands learned what they know. She sat down. The stillness that followed was the kind that happens when a room recalibrates. The front rows were motionless. The back of the hall was not. Sebastian had been standing against the side wall for the duration of the evening, and now he walked to the front of the room, and the attention of the assembly followed him. He stood at the front and said, clearly and without preamble, that his engagement to Miss Arabella Penhallow was ended. He named the greenhouse kiss as a staged arrangement, as something he had been managed into and had failed to see, and he named it without drama, as a fact he had a responsibility to state publicly. Then he produced a folded document from his coat pocket and read from it. A deed of transfer conveying the Larkfield barn and the surrounding 4 acres to Miss Lydia Penhallow by name, in perpetuity, independent of the Hartcross estate and its successors. He had signed it before tonight. It required only her acceptance to take effect. He walked to the back of the room and held it out to her. Lydia looked at the document in his hand. She looked at his face, which was steady and quiet and entirely without the ease that had always characterized it. The charm was gone, and what was left underneath was less polished and considerably more real. She took the deed from him with both hands. Sebastian stepped back. He did not ask her anything. Not in that room, in front of that assembly, with 40 children watching and the county families rearranging their expressions. The deed was the statement. The question could wait. He stepped back and let the room be what it was, and Lydia held the document in her hands and looked down at her name on it. Lydia Penhallow, Larkfield. And for a moment said nothing at all. Several days passed. The assembly's aftermath moved through the county in the usual way. Talked about at breakfast tables, revised in the retelling, gradually absorbed into the body of local history as one of those evenings that people would later claim to have attended whether they had or not. Arabella departed for her aunt's house in Bath within the week, with her dignity intact and her plans in ruins. And if she understood what she had lost more clearly than she had expected to, she did not say so to anyone. Sebastian came to the barn on a late afternoon 4 days after the assembly. The children had gone. Lydia was sweeping chalk dust toward the door in the low winter light, the wide broom making a dry, rhythmic sound on the stone floor. He came in without announcing himself, and found the week's clean slates stacked in an uneven pile against the east wall, and began straightening them, working through the stack with the quiet, methodical attention of a man who has learned to be useful in a small space. Lydia swept and watched him for a moment. Then she said, "Why do you keep coming?" He stopped. He set the last slate against the wall and turned to face her. And he did not answer immediately in the way he once would have, easily, fluently, with the social grace that had always come so naturally. He stood with his hands at his sides and said, "I spent 6 months courting a version of you that required nothing of me. I decided you were sensible and composed, and that this was enough. And I never asked a single question that might have shown me I was wrong." He stopped and started again. "I have spent the last 2 months trying to learn what I failed to ask. I know where you go on Tuesdays. I know that Ellen read 3 full pages last week, and that the January chalk order needs to go out by Friday. I know that you left before I gave you a reason to, because you had already heard enough to know what I was." He looked at her directly. "I am still learning. I do not know what you will do with that." Lydia set the broom against the wall. She crossed the room to where he stood, and she kissed him. Once, slow and deliberate, her hands at her sides, on her own terms, in her own building. When she stepped back, she did not explain it. She did not apologize for it or qualify it. She looked at him with the level, clear attention that had always been her way of seeing. And he looked back at her with his new, less fluent honesty, and neither of them spoke for a moment. and the chalk dust settled in the last of the afternoon light. One spring later, on a bright afternoon in April, the barn school at Larkfield filled with the sound of children leaving for the day, voices and footsteps and the scrape of bench legs on stone. And Sebastian stood at the great door and held it open, and 3 children said goodbye to him by name, because he had been there enough times that they knew it. The last child out was Martha, who paused to inform him that the globe had been repaired and was back on the shelf, which he agreed was very good news, and then she ran to catch up with Ellen on the lane. The next morning, 2 cups of tea sat cooling on the teacher's desk among the account books and the chalk orders and the lesson plans for the following week, and beside them lay a sheet of manuscript paper covered in Lydia's hand. A composition she had been writing in the evenings, something for the children to play at the spring assembly, the melody built from the rhythms of their recitations. At the top of the page, in her own clear script, she had written the title. Below it, she had signed her name, Lydia Penhallow, Larkfield, her own name, her own work, her own building on her own 4 acres, in the spring light that came through the high windows and lay across the desk in long, warm bars, illuminating everything she had built in the years when no one was watching. And the man who had finally learned to look, sitting across from her with his tea, asking her what the children would think of the bridge passage in the 3rd measure. She told him. He listened. Outside, the lane to Larkfield was dry and clear, and the hedges were coming into leaf, and the 40 pairs of hands that no deed could close were already on their way home through the morning.